conditions as uncharted territory, with climate patterns shifting, drought intensifying, and the fire season starting earlier and ending later. This may become the new norm for California and other western states. Despite firefighting technology, despite technological advancements, nature has taught people that emotional forces meet. Grief, fear, and uncertainty break the hearts of many. To lower the hill, officials are urging the federal government to provide additional support, including additional firefighting aircraft, temporary housing for evacuees, and mental health support for traumatized families. Youth, scientists, and environmentalists are pushing for long-term solutions.
Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. So this book is Black Women Taught Us, and this book is by Jenn Jackson, An Intimate History of Feminine Black Feminism. And I got this book from the library. I wanted to read it and see what it's about. Seems like it's a pretty good book. So let's hop right in. Let's get started. Black Women Taught Us by Jenn Jackson. It's published by the Random House in New York. These are the contents of the book. Okay, see if you can see them. All right, so there's 204 pages total. The first chapter is about the introduction. Actually, I'm gonna start there. So we're gonna be reading a book about history on Black women and where things started in history. You guys, for everybody in LA, sending prayers out to those who are experiencing the fire right now, going through anything. My condolences. Try to enjoy yourself for this 4th of July. But we're about to be reading Jenn Jackson, by the author who wrote this, and it's called Black Women Taught Us. I'm going to start with the introduction. All right, so every Wednesday as I grew up, our tiny 2-bedroom home welcomed a concert hall for a majestic group of gospel singers. Auntie Donna Faye, No Blood. Welcome to the channel, you guys. Auntie Donna Faye, No Blood, relation to me, a tall woman with a perfect astronomical bob, long curved fingernails, and a no sense glare, was the alto who always rested right in a no of the vocal pocket. Auntie Barbara, also no blood relation, who was the oldest of the group, but would never share her actual age, always wore a big curly wig and red lipstick. She was a soprano from another generation of black singers. Sharon was a quiet, sarcastic woman who was baritone voice whose baritone voice could rumble the whole house with when she murmured a hymn along to any song. Sometimes I would tiptoe into the living room during rehearsal just to hear Sharon's hymns and sneak back out before my mom noticed. My mother's sister Deborah was one of the greatest voices I had ever heard, a soprano whose vibrato made me made you feel like you were lying in a blanket fresh out of the dryer. I also thought she was a, a different world actress, Jasmine Guy, for most of my childhood because she resembled the actress so closely. Cassandra, the group's pianist and local arranger, who'd glide into the room. No, this is not a manual. I'm reading. Who glide into the room with her deep voice and thick rimmed glasses every week. She was such a quietly powerful presence. Then there was my mother, Cynthia, and a unassuming woman standing at 5'5". She was always in a battle with her weight. She was and still is a beautiful brown skinned woman with a perfectly placed mole nestled at the base of her philtrum, the area right below the nose that some people call the Cupid's bow. My mother could sing anything and exuded so much charisma when she performed that most audience members got excited just to see her open her mouth and to ask her for gifts or to bask her in gifts. As a child, I always looked forward to seeing this aspiring group of women who would crowd into our living room for their Wednesday rehearsals, circling our upright piano, singing all manner of gospel songs. Cassandra named the group Majesty before I was born, and just as it was for her kids, it was one of the first words I learned. Majesty toured Oakland and the rest of the San Francisco area throughout the 80s and 90s, performing traditional gospel hits. They were known for their vocal embellishments that stemmed from years of listening to the studying the greats like Shirley Caesar and the Clark sisters. Singing high into the rafters and deep into the vocal valleys was common for them. The members of Majesty were different from the singers my church, community, and family saw on Bobby Gospel's Jones Gospel every Sunday afternoon. They were our mothers, aunties, grandmothers, church leaders, and Sunday school teachers. They were the women who raised us, cooked for us, put on our band aids, and scolded us for crossing the street without looking first. They were ours. Fill my cup, let it overflow. Fill my cup and let it overflow. Fill it up, and let it overflow. Let it overflow with love. They would sing while forming their lips into perfect O shapes. They also sang 12 Gates to the City by the famous Davis sisters. The harmonies that enam- en- emanated from that living room sounded like they were ordained by God, likely because they were. Meanwhile, in my room, I'd be entertaining the kids. Sometimes Auntie Barbara would bring a grandchild or two, and Sharon would do the same. I would immediately shift from being a usually lonely only child into a makeshift hostess and pseudo mother for the younger kids. I set up the little ones with video games so that I'd be free to style the hair of my younger cousins, Esther, Lily, and Lizzie, Cassandra's three little sisters. She had five children in total, but the boys were usually as far away from my makeshift hair salon as possible. We all had a nickname at that point, or two at that point. The house was only ever full like this on rehearsal nights and holidays. They were some of the most joyful nights of my young life. To prepare for these evenings and to my weekly hosting duties, I taught myself how to cook. I wanted to offer something, a small gift, to those women who brought so much warmth to the home. Rehearsal was at the end of the day, often after they had been working for hours and caring for children. Feeding them seemed like a kind of necessary gesture. By around the age of 4, I could scramble eggs. At age 8, I tried my hand at baked chicken. Cynthia, this chicken is raw in the middle, Auntie Barbara told my mom one week as she pulled the meat from the bone, exposing the red vertebrae and tendons that were clearly uncooked. Jennifer, be careful, my mom scolded. Yes, mommy, I replied, feeling deflated. Don't be too hard on her, Cynthia. The chicken is seasoned so well, Auntie Barbara told her. You did good, baby. Just cook it a little longer next time and poke it with a knife to see if blood comes out, okay? She said as she leaned over to me, her lipstick bright and smudged from the chicken. Yes, Auntie Barbara, I said, feeling determined to do better. as though this was just an assignment for me to conquer. Like my auntie Barbara and the other members of Majesty, my mother, grandmothers, and my extended community of black women and queer folks would often offer me lessons, teachings from their own lives, lessons that they had struggled to learn themselves, but that they likely saved them time and again. Auntie Donna taught me about navigating the world in a tall, large body frame. Don't ever get dressed up and put on lipstick without throwing on some earrings, girl. She would tell me at church. I still chuckle about this lesson whenever I see the collection of spare earrings on my desk. Sometimes the lessons were harder and carried more weight, like when my grandmother, an outspoken, ambitious, and headstrong black woman, warned me, baby, people like us spend a lot of time alone. So you just have to find people who love you and love them right back. I was 11 years old when she said that. At that time, I didn't understand what she meant by people like us. I understand now. This informal knowledge, network, and storytelling community introduced me to the central tenets of black feminism before I had the language or the training to utter those words in that sequence. But no one tells you, at least no one told me, that these quiet quotation experiences, these everyday black feminisms, matter or that they contain essential wisdom and knowledge for living. The recipes, the dating advice, the movement, work, and the church and the community organizing. Instead, just the most of the world, I failed to see these women's work in my life as nuanced, different, significant, or deeply rooted in an ongoing fight for liberation and freedom. It wasn't until I was surrounded with witnesses or whiteness that these lessons became clearer to me. I grew up in the highly segregated Oakland area, which means that I didn't have many interactions with white people until I left to college. Even while my childhood overflowed with black women and black feminisms, I wasn't impelled to think about feminism in an academic or even a formal sense. In truth, I just wasn't aware that any of this literature existed. I attended an elite private institution, but I never took a course on black feminism because none were offered. During undergrad, I had only one black woman professor. I had no idea that race, gender, and LGBTQIA plus scholars and researchers had been waging a decades long battle against universities and their donors to make room for the study of diverse people on these campuses. The predominantly white campuses I gained access to successfully obfuscated the lack of willingness and desire to center black studies and especially black feminism in their curricula. And while my mother had done her best to teach me about the interactions of race, gender, class, and disability, she did so out of a need to survive. She had no college degrees or personal studies to equip her with the theories, concepts, and teachings of black women thinkers and activists. Rather, she spoke from the experience of growing up poor in Berkeley, California, living in dilapidated homes with her mother and two younger siblings, learning to outrun her abusive and alcoholic father, and surviving a world full of rejection. Rejection of her sharply, shapely black body, her thick lips, her wide set nose, her kinky hair, and her brown skin. She taught me that these experiences were both the poison and the fuel that she used to raise me. In 2007, I was working at Disneyland as a workforce analyst, which is a fancy way of saying that I was using math to make hiring and staffing more efficient for my employer. For years, I struggled with being paid less than many of my peers, facing daily subtle racist comments and gestures, and being constantly reminded that I was different from everyone else on my team. As far as they could tell, I was both black and a woman. At that time, no one knew I was a polyamorous, queer, and gender flux, not even me. Sometimes during busy work weeks, white women would loudly declare, Jen, this is my favorite of your hairs, and they'd sometimes touch it without my permission. While I recognized this as racist and sexist actions, I didn't know how to interpret them, and I couldn't understand where they stemmed from or how to eradicate them altogether. Then in 2009, in the wee hours of the morning on New Year's Day, 22-year-old Oscar Grant was killed by BART police officer Johannes Mercelli at the Fruitvale BART station in Oakland, California. I was only 24 years old at the time. That was a station I had frequented growing up. It was no more than 10 minutes from my grandmother's house, and it served as a key thoroughfare to my many young people growing up in the East Oakland. Oscar's death was so personal, so intimate. It was the first time the police killing truly shattered me. The next year, 7-year-old Ayanna Stanley Jones was killed by Detroit SWAT in a botched raid. She was lying on the couch in her grandmother's arms when gunshots erupted. She was killed instantly. It was another heartbreak. I was a mother at that point. The loss of black women hit me differently. It hurt in a way I had never encountered before. My desperation in my work life and the ongoing violence against black people I was witnessing online catalyzed a deep hunger in me to learn more about myself, my four mothers, and my larger black feminist community. My own evolution as a black woman and a parent to black children sent me on a voracious trek to find answers. I wanted to understand why these things were happening and why it felt like it was my responsibility to end them. I called my mom first, as I typically do when I have burning questions about black life. Mama, who were the black women who wrote those books on your shelf at your house in East Oakland? Tell me their names. Who? Like Alice Walker? Terry McMillan? I wrote down the names on a sticky note. Yes, Alice Walker wrote the one about female criticism in Africa, right? Yep, Processing the Secret of Joy. That was it. I had to find that book. I knew that if I find it, I could find others like it. On a balmy Saturday morning in Orange County, California, I went to Borders, hunting for the titles and voices I had seen on my mother's shelf. In a frantic search, I came across Melissa Harris, Perry's sister citizen. The cover was immediately striking. It featured a black woman's face, her eyes closed, her head shaved, with the American flag overlaying her skin. I had to know what was inside. This was my first encounter with a book that was expressly written to interpret and frame black women's unique experiences in the United States. Though I had grown up reading the fiction of Zora Neale Hurston, Sister Soldier, and Toni Morrison, it had never drawn on me that these stories resonated with me because of my own experience as a poor black girl living in a world that saw blackness as a cardinal sin. In Sister Citizen, Harris Perry wrote about the crooked room, where black women's identities were often contorted to fit the desires and expectations of others. Harris Perry explained that the cricket room stems from stereotypes like the Jezebel, the hypersexual black woman, the mammy, the asexual black woman, the mammy, the asexual black woman caretaker, and the sapphire, the angry black woman. I read the book. I cried into the book. I read the book again. Harris Perry said that black women should endeavor to stand upright in that crooked room. This was the first time an analogy rocked me to the core, to my core. I imagine having walked around the world for 27 years hunched over, shaped like a lowercase f. I reflected on the crooked rooms I've encountered at work and at school, and I cried once more, overwhelmed at the force of recognition. During this time, I began digging into the black feminist literature because of the conditions of the world around me. The first black president had been elected, and the beautiful black woman was living in the White House with two black girls. Black president. President Obama's message of hope had excited me and drawn me towards social action in a new way. Simultaneously, I became increasingly aware of racial injustice in the United States. When my coworkers whispered to my boss about me being unapproachable and angry, my white colleagues at school avoiding working with me in study groups because they assumed I was only a USC because of racial quotas, I realized that these individual experiences were related to the forms of oppression that my mother and larger community had already encountered. It was clear to me that abusive treatment from black men, the discrimination from white people, the classes surveillance from which rich folks in the segregated neighborhoods of Oakland, and fatphobia, the fat phobia from within our own community, where we're all connected. Excuse me, we're all connected. They were microcosisms, excuse me, microsisms. How do you say that word? Microsms of the larger systematic problems of white supremacy, anti-blackness, and what Moya Bailey and Trudy All misogynoir, the gender scientific racism faced by black women. I began to see that all of these systems were connected to the issues I had witnessed my whole life, like the mass incarceration of my family and friends, police harassment of my brother and cousins, and anti black violence all over the United States. Then I became angry. I recalled how in high school we weren't taught many lessons that focused on the contributions of black women in history. When we were, our schools were when our schools were selective in what they taught. Harriet Tubman was the only black woman I came across in my history class. They told us she was a fugitive slave who freed hundreds of enslaved black people via the Underground Railroad. But they didn't tell us that Tubman was a military leader in the Civil War. They never taught us that in 1863, Tubman led soldiers along the Combahee River with Colonel James Montgomery to raid the South Carolina rice plantation. They never told us that General Tubman was a Union spy and recruiter. Instead, the interpretation of Tubman's otherwise radical life that they taught us was co opted and watered down, effectively erasing the parts of her history that threatened our nation's preference for stories about nonviolent resistance. Rather than frame Tubman as a fierce and persistent abolitionist whose work was animated by a deep commitment to ending chattel bondage, the enslavement of black people under the supposition that they were property akin to cattle, and and carceral logics. The larger surveillance state that the resorts to criminalization and punishment to eradicate anyone the state deems deviant. Across the United States, they sterilized her legacy and taught us that she helped free the slaves. I began searching for women who are writing about our varied black experiences. What I found was that the many of the books I have voraciously read at the foot of my mother's bed growing up were out of print, hard to find in local bookstores, or simply inaccessible due to the printing press's high costs. It often took several searches, calls to bookstores, and waiting lists to get a chance to purchase books by prominent feminists. Luckily, after 2004, the advent of social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Tumblr gave us access to the world and to black feminists on every continent. Those of us who had been avid readers of Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, and Bell Books were now being introduced to people just like us on the internet who were sharing their lived experiences with anti blackness, police and gender discrimination, and everything in between. Rationalists, Crunk Feminist Collective, and Trudy's blog Gradient Liar were early platforms that worked to consolidate our experiences and translate them in critical and nuanced ways. I realized too that black feminists were everywhere, just like my mother and the women of majesty. Young black women in my communities at the intersections of queerness, movements, education, social work, and the like were wait, interactions of queers, movements, education, social work, and the like were putting words to the experiences I had witnessed and endured. And while much of that work had not been published on mainstream websites, printed in books, or highlighted on the evening news, that work was resonating with all of us. And taking in all of this literature on black women's theorizing and activism, I have found a mirror of my own of my own realities and those of the women I had encountered as I grew up. Having now discovered parts of myself that had been neglected and had grown over with insecurities, I became obsessed with learning myself, society, and the potential more for a more just world. So I kept reading, following Harris Perry's bibliography like it was the yellow brick road. First, I read Bell Books' Feminism is for Everybody, a guidebook on introducing feminism to men and other non women who don't understand its implications for their lives. Next, I read Audre Lorde's essay, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. The short essay snapped me out of the idea that assimilation was ideal or even possible for black women who believe in freedom. Lordy wrote, those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is in learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. In Lordy's words, I heard my grandmother's voice telling me about how lonesome it would be to be one of us. It was though Lordy's confrontation with the master's tools that I began to confront the ways in which I had internalized white supremacy, anti blackness, homophobia, classism, ableism, and in my own life and heart. I realized that by chasing whiteness, I was hustling backward in a game I was never set to win. As a queer and trans person who was also navigating multiple disabilities, anxiety, depression, Marfan syndrome, a congenital heart disease, and blindness, I was coming to see that so many of the phobias and antagonisms I had held in my body were antagonisms I was holding about myself. Then George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin in 2012. I heard the 911 call. I sobbed, crying over the loss. The heartbreak felt unbearable this time. When the verdict in the Zimmerman case came down, I was the mother of two small children with my third on the way. I was sitting in a convention center in Washington, D.C. at the National Conference for Delta Sigma Theta Inc., a service oriented sorority serving predominantly black women. You guys, I'm going to stop it there and I will be back for the next part two.